Drova Forsaken Kin, henceforth known simply as Drova for obvious reasons, is a 2024 old-school isometric action RPG developed by German studio Just 2D. It's safe to say that the timing of Drova's release could not have been more, I don't want to say funny, but somewhere between bittersweet and that X died welcome back Y meme. See, in June 2024, mere months before Drova dropped and started making waves in the RPG Unk community, Piranha Bytes of Gothic fame officially ceased to exist. To say I felt sad by Piranha Bytes' disappearance would be an understatement. This was the studio that gave me some of my most cherished childhood memories. I still remember fighting the miserable mid-2000s Romanian winters on my way home from school, anxious to resume my adventures in Gothic, workshopping combat tactics and strategies with myself, making mental notes of the areas I'd already explored. I wonder if I missed something in Xardis' tower. Didn't an NPC mention that there's an entire sewer system below Korenes? Maybe this will be the night I'll finally defeat that troll in the north. So what's all this have to do with Drova? How about the fact that Drova is the closest possible thing to the old school Gothic experience that all heads, myself included, have been craving for the last, I don't know, 20 years? Yes, I know Arcolos exists, I have played it and I promise I'll get to it in a future video. I meant in terms of original IPs. Mutually exclusive factions with interesting motivations and philosophies? Check. Faction-based gear progression? Check. Beasts with realistic behavior? Check. A nameless protagonist who starts as a nobody and slowly and gradually climbs the social ladder? Check. Trainer-based progression system? Check. And so much more. So let's get into Drova and see what it's about. Before we start, I have a Blue Sky where I barely post and a Patreon where you can support the channel with real-life money. I also have that channel membership thingy, which I honestly have no idea how it works, but feel free to support me there if you know, dig my videos. Alright, let's get into it. Drova takes place in a grimdark fantasy universe with some Celtic mythology elements. The premise goes something like this. You are a random nobody who comes from a village that's barely hanging by a thread. Like dozens of villagers die every winter type of barely hanging by a thread. One day you witness a group of warriors returning to the village with a crystal. Two druids leave the village with the mysterious artifact, hoping its power would unlock a portal to Drova, a fabled land of peace and prosperity. With nothing else better to do, you decide to follow the druids. Things go horribly, and I mean horribly wrong, leaving you as the sole survivor of the trip. With their last breath, the druid entrusts you with the crystal, which you are to take to the druids in the city of Nemeton, one of the two major settlements in Drova. And so begins your adventure. You quickly realize that Drova is not exactly the bountiful paradise it had been built up to be. Quite the opposite, actually. Bandits roam the countryside, ready to attack and extort traveling merchants. Drova's settlers, both seasoned warriors and simple travelers, often fall prey to wolves, wargs, frogmen, lichens, swamp creatures, and all kinds of terrifying beasts. Drova was once home to an ancient civilization, whose trap-laden ruins filled with all manner of mysterious contraptions and machinery now dot the map. Finally, the settlers are not exactly dying of hunger, but their resources and production and defense capabilities have been stretched thin since the city of Nemeton splintered into two factions. Nemeton, a loose coalition of druids, merchants and craftspeople who believe in Drova's potential to become a paradise, and the Remnants Camp, a mercenary-like faction who want to, leave it behind. And then there's you, a squishy little villager dressed in rags who can barely swing a stick. Virtually no one has the time nor disposition to babysit you. What's worse, they couldn't give less of a shit about your so-called crystal that may or may not hold the power to transform Drova for generations to come. You are a nobody, a poor sucker who's trapped in a foreign land with the average life expectancy of a farm cat. Did I mention that you're a nobody? I can't stress enough how much of a nobody you are, but that's okay. There's a place for you here, but only if you're willing to put in the work. That means listening to the settlers' plights and helping out where you can, practicing your swings and thrusts. Maybe one day you'll be able to slay something stronger than a mole rat. And even if you somehow become
Rocco de Mayo.
Oh yeah.
Cocksucker had the toughest reputation in Essex County, but he never
Sorry,
came back
wrong
after I got
video. You are nothing without your people. A home and community you can call your own. But again, nothing's free. You have to earn it. As usual, more on this later. Anyways, let's move on to the presentation.
It's the jacket! The jacket.
Visually, Drova goes for a retro pixel art style displayed from a top-down isometric-ish perspective. You'd think this level of graphical and physical remove from the action would neuter the immersive feeling found in something like Gothic, but fortunately that couldn't be farther from the truth. And that's because the game's environments are handcrafted. For that reason, Drova's art direction is some of the best I've seen in recent memory. From Nemeton's Celtic-inspired architecture to the remnant camps, shantytown set on top of ancient ruins theme, and the 3 separate biomes with their fauna and flora, there's lots of detail to absorb and enjoy. Rats scurry around in caves and basements. Actually, there's rats everywhere in this game. Frogs and butterflies and mosquitoes chill next to ponds. Insects pollinate plants. Every detail and design flourish feels deliberate. You know you're in for something special when you enter a minor quest location, like say a cellar or an optional cave, and it's just as lovingly designed as a main quest dungeon. You barely notice the difference. And like any fantasy RPG worth its salt, Drova's taverns feel decisively cozy and homey. Mind you, Drova's map isn't big by any stretch of the imagination, but similar to Gothic, its handcrafted nature and denseness with detail makes it feel larger than it actually is. There's absolutely no wasted space here. If there's no loot to collect or plants to harvest, there's usually some visual flourish to keep you invested, like a pretty waterfall or something. That's why the map never felt barren to me even after I had literally made it so by slaying every single beast. Oh, and one detail that I really liked but didn't know where to put in the script was how corpses, be it human or beast, gradually decompose throughout the chapters. Carcasses don't disappear like in other games, they just sit there forever. I always appreciate these small instances of continuity in games, even when they lead to some, let's call them moments of accidental comedy, like these bandits that I lured to a couple of remnants guards because I was too weak to kill them on my own. The guards wrecked their shit, resumed their posts, and left the bodies there to decompose for the entire game. My headcanon is that they played the game of rock, paper, scissors to decide who would move the bodies, but it ended in a tie and they just said, fuck it, we ain't paid enough for this shit, and left the bodies there. I know it sounds stupid, but you can't deny there is a non-zero chance that this exact situation happened, at least, you know, once in human history. Anyway, I'm ranting again. Now, I wouldn't exactly say Drova kills it in the sound and music department, but it does have its highlights. There's a dedicated music theme for each of the 2 factions, as well as for the 3 available biomes, and some one-off tracks for key story moments, but that's kind of about it. Apart from the Nemeton theme and the track that plays in the Headless Ripper Inn, I wouldn't say that there's a track that truly stood out to me. Maybe it's a taste thing, but I don't know. Another thing you should know is that there's no voice acting in Drova. The dialogue is entirely text-based. Well, not exactly. Characters may not speak, but they do emote in key moments. They laugh, moan, make approving sounds, which does add a lot of personality to these characters. One thing they do a lot, even more than the theatricals I mentioned above, is spitting. My god, do these people like to spit. I've never seen so much spitting in a game in my entire life. There's like FIFA World Cup quantities of spit in this game. I'd walk around the remnants camp after joining Nemeton or browse a merchant's inventory and just hear someone spitting in the background. It never stopped being funny. Anyways, let's move on to the gameplay. At its core, Drova is a top-down open-world RPG with some old-school flavor sprinkled on top. Let's start with exploration and world design. Now, I should clarify from the start that when I say open world, I don't mean the bloated checklist-driven template that dominated video games in the 2010s. I mean it in the sense that most of the map is accessible to the player from the beginning, but a handful of locations that unlock when the player has reached the relevant story beat. The only thing preventing the player from entering and exploring an area is their ability to overcome its dangers, which usually come in the form of monsters or powerful human fighters. Call it a natural roadblock. In other words, instead of objectives or items, player progress is soft-gated by enemy placement. There's nothing stopping you from doing the equivalent of a soul level 1 run and cleaning the map before hitting any of the main objectives, but that wouldn't be an ideal experience. Some high level enemies can absolutely wreck your shit and take forever forever to kill, even late game. If you're struggling with an area, you're meant to backtrack and revisit it when you've gained enough experience to tackle it. If this method of soft-gating progress sounds suspiciously similar to Gothic's way of doing things, that's because this is literally how it worked in Gothic. Down to marking down a wolf-infested thicket of woods as glorious chest here, don't forget to revisit, and forgetting you had marked it down not 2 seconds later and never revisiting it. Best case scenario, you stumble upon that chest while revisiting the area for an entirely different reason, only to realize that its contents, let's say a sword, are now useless. Of course, that's just a hypothetical case that never happened to me. Never. Thankfully, in Drova you can mark key locations on your map. However, in a very Gothic-like twist that I could have sworn was in that game had I not replayed it recently, you need to buy ink from the same merchant that sells you the first map. Don't worry, it's not a recurring mechanic, ink is a one-time purchase and it never runs out. A vital purchase I might add, because in Drova I found myself relying on the map more often than I expected, even during the second playthrough that I did for this video, to the point that I'm sure there's like 4 cumulative hours of footage that's just me opening the map and wondering where in the absolute fuck I am. To be clear, this is not a slight on the game, it's just that Drova's maze-like 2D world design takes some getting used to. Often the road from point A to point B will not be a straight shot. You'll encounter natural blockers like say a cliff or a deep pond or a thicket of woods that will force you to take detours that could take anything between 2 to 5 minutes to complete. That is, if you have a rough idea of where you need to go in the first place. Drova has no quest markers, or really any markers to speak of. All you have is your map and occasionally the directions that NPCs give you. Sometimes. This old school approach to exploration might sound intimidating, but there's no reason to feel that way. The world is designed to be explored with minimal information. You're always a few feet away from a landmark of some sort, and if you get lost, there's always a monster to slay or an interesting bit of world building to see. Plus, the devs took great care to include tons of nooks and crannies and secrets to reward curious players. In fact, this is exactly why you're encouraged from the very start to abuse the inspect mechanic as often as possible. Using it can reveal tracks leading to hidden stashes and caves, crafting materials, buried treasures, hidden mechanisms, and all sorts of secrets. In one particular quest, I even found a new way to solve it by using the inspect mechanic. I'm gonna be real with you, it's been a long time since I had this much fun exploring an open world. Sure, the fact that Drova's open world is significantly smaller than your average game helps, but I think it goes deeper than that. It's not so much a matter of size as it is the fact that Drova's open world is done really well. The biomes flow into one another seamlessly. The two major settlements are equally distanced. There's a clear logic behind enemy loot and placement. It all harkens back to that handcrafted, deliberate feel I mentioned earlier. Just like in, you guessed it, Gothic. Okay, enough dancing around the similarities between Drova and Gothic. Let's take a bit and really dive into them. So, remember how if you walked into someone's house in Gothic, the owner would shoo you away? That's exactly how it works in Drova. Or how brandishing a weapon in public spaces would piss off nearby NPCs? That's exactly how it works in Drova. Or how animals and beasts would act realistically and that they'd warn you before attacking? You guessed it, that's also in Drova. The option to beat the shit out of any NPC and rob them blind? Yep, you can do that in Drova. Sleazy, power-tripping middle management types that abuse and extort you. Wow, it really feels like home. Dramatic chapter transitions. Also here. You know, I remember having drunken conversations with friends about how cool and immersive Gothic's world design is, and how awesome it would be to replicate them in our own, totally not hypothetical future Gothic-inspired game that we would totally get around to making one day. And Just 2D just rolled their sleeves and actually made it. I can't express how surreal it is to see these mechanics in an original non-Piranha Bytes IP. It's like seeing the child of a deceased actor playing a younger version of their parents' most popular role. That's not to say Drova is a carbon copy of Gothic, it's that the devs understood what made Gothic so special and put their own spin on the formula. Just walking around Nemeton or the Remnants camp is enough to see how much effort they put into making them feel like real places. Within the limitations of an independent action RPG, of course. Even the placement of certain certain areas and settlements feels deliberate and thought out. There's an inn at the halfway point between the two major faction strongholds, reinforcing its role as a natural stopping and resting point for merchants and travelers. Nemeton, historically insular and wary of outsiders, but fully aware of its economic hardships caused by the recent schism which led half of its population to leave and form the Remnants camp. Wow, what a convoluted fucking sentence. Placed its merchants district right next to the southern entrance of the settlement, while the crafts district, inn and the religious site are on the opposite side of the settlement. The idea here is that merchants would enter through the southern gate, unload their goods and purchase products from the merchants district and immediately leave. Look, I don't know if this layout was intentional in the way I just described, but it just makes sense to me. As for the Remnants, since its economy is based almost entirely on mining ore, the first thing you'll see when entering the settlement is the workers' camp. Since the ore mine already has sleeping quarters for the workers, I can only assume the shantytown from the Remnants camp and the nearby cave are meant to host miners who are on extended breaks or want to participate in the arena. You actually do meet someone who worked his way up from miner to arena fighter, the very guy who accompanies you to the mine. And that's kind of all I've had to say about Drova's world design. Mind you, it's not as deep as in Gothic. For example, I think I noticed beasts fighting each other once, maybe twice during my 60 hours of playtime, but it's understandable given the game's smaller scope and budget. With that out of the way, let's talk about combat and progression. So I think it comes as no surprise that Drova's combat and progression systems borrow heavily from Gothic, but not necessarily in the ways you'd expect. Let's start with the progression system. Similar to Gothic, Drova has a trainer and learning points based progression system. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Gothic series, it works something like this. You get XP by slaying enemies and completing quests. When you reach the XP threshold, you level up and gain 4 learning points. Now, if this were any other RPG, you'd simply pop open the menu and invest those learning points in whatever attribute and skill you wanted. But here, you have to actively seek out a trainer to spend the learning points. But not just any trainer. Hunters will teach you how to shoot with the bow and extract resources from game, say tusks from boars, pelts from wolves, frog legs from a frogman, and so on. Roguish type NPCs will teach you how to pick complex locks. There are also trainers specialized in various forms of combat like sword, axe, spear, daggers, shield. And of course there's RPG standards like strength, dexterity and mind that you can boost at nearly any combat focused trainer, except obviously mind, for which you have to seek out a magic user to train. Having to actively seek out trainers and pay them to upgrade your character might be annoying to some people, but I enjoy this approach because it makes the progression system feel more involved and realistic. I say realistic because in Drova, and yes, Gothic too, knowledge is a privilege and purely transactional in nature. Some trainers will ask for money or waive their fees in exchange for a favor, while others will outright refuse to train you unless you're a member of their faction. And, you know, it does make a lot of sense. Imagine you're, say, a Nemeton fighter. You've slowly and steadily climbed the ladder to become a well-respected member of a notoriously insular community. Why would you waste your precious time teaching a rags-wearing random nobody how to swing a sword? You'd probably have better things to do, like, I don't know, venturing through a fogling-infested area to find a screaming plant and give it to the tavern baddie during the Festival of Fire? Look, I said that you'd have better things to do, not things vital to the survival of the community you'd sworn your undying loyalty to. Also, don't worry about it, we'll talk about the screaming plants later. Actually, let's talk about the screaming plants now. So, Drova features a crafting system. Other than making a few essential items like healing potions or whatever, I don't normally bother with crafting systems in RPGs. But in Drova, crafting is so essential to progression that you kinda have to engage with it. As you might have guessed, the crafting system borrows heavily from Gothic, especially in regards to material scarcity. With a few notable exceptions like wood, there's a finite number of certain resources available in the world. Plants don't respawn between chapters, and the same principle applies to the beasts you'd extract certain resources from. This means that you have to plan ahead very carefully, and making rookie mistakes like consuming healing plants instead of using them as part of healing ointments and potions, or selling your inventory of crafting materials will cost you down the line. As for monsters, it's recommended, but not mandatory, to put off slaying the stronger ones until you unlock at least half of the hunting skills for one simple reason. More crafting materials to create consumables like bleeding and poisonous knives, and hunting trophies to sell to merchants for a hefty price. You could technically backtrack and harvest the carcasses later, but Come on. If you don't want to bother with the crafting system too much, just remember these 3 plants: basil root, cliff lichen, and mandragora, aka the screaming plant I mentioned earlier. These are essential and extremely rare plants used to make permanent stat potions, just like in that other game that I've been extra careful not to excessively mention in this video. Basil root gives +1 to strength when consumed and +3 when combined with a mandragora and a potion. And the same thing applies to the cliff lichen. Just keep these permanent stat potions top of mind and don't worry about the myriad of healing potions found in Drova. You'll find the recipe sooner rather than later, as the game does a great job of sort of leading you to their locations. Combat is where Drova both borrows and deviates from Gothic. Something that people, including me, really liked about the Gothic series was how tangible your character's progression felt. As the player character trained with a weapon and became more proficient with it, their progression and skill was reflected in new animations and increasingly powerful combos, as long as you timed them correctly, that is. In other words, you started the game by barely being able to hold a one-handed sword with both hands, only to slowly and gradually become a killing machine capable of slaying a troll within a couple of swings. That approach to character progression is also present in Drova, but with a few twists. Drova's combat is built around combos and casting abilities and synergizing said abilities, respectively. See that white meter below the HP bar? That's the focus bar. You need it to cast abilities and skills. As you attack enemies, the focus bar fills up, but it can also go down if you take damage. Once the bar reaches the required focus threshold, you can activate whatever ability or skill you've assigned to the hotkey and rinse and repeat until the combat encounter is over. It sounds incredibly basic, but here's the thing. Abilities have different focus thresholds, and it's not like enemies will just wait around politely until you've built enough focus to cast them. Plus, there's a lot of skills and abilities, both physical and magical, which may or may not stack, and just as many synergies to play around with. Here's an example. One of the first and frankly most useful abilities you get is Wound, which inflicts 150% weapon damage and causes bleed. As you may imagine, it stacks like a... Just imagine I inserted a clever analogy here. Anyways, Wound combined with Blood Frenzy, which inflicts the same amount of weapon damage, an additional 35% weapon damage per active bleed, and adds an additional bleed effect, you can do some ungodly amounts of destruction to your foes. Pop open a potion that increases focus and you can chain some ridiculous attacks together. Once you figure out how the combo system works and settle on a build, you shouldn't have too much trouble with the combat. Light/heavy attack, dodge/block with shield, attack, cast ability, repeat, that's all there is to it. Of course, you can also spice things up with bombs and traps and throwing knives, but I wouldn't say they are essential. I mean, they were essential for me because I'm objectively bad at games, but that's an entirely different discussion. It's worth mentioning that I might not be the most qualified person to judge the quality or depth of Drova's combat, as I went for a very basic, very defensive, heavy armor, sword and shield build in both playthroughs. I'm just unimaginative like that. However, what Drova's combat may lack in complexity, it more than makes up for with build variety. From what I can tell, there is enough build variety to justify 2, maybe 3 playthroughs, assuming you plan to take a build all the way through to the end of the game and not respec. I heard spear-based dex builds are super fun. I wouldn't know because, again, I'm the kind of guy who plays pure strength builds in RPGs. Oh, and you should also know that there's no dedicated mage class in the traditional sense, but to the devs' credit, they work hard to include more options for magic users and post-launch updates. The last thing I want to touch on is the side content. While Drova's quest offer is not exactly plentiful, what's here is, for the most part, pretty high quality. Drova front-loads the majority of its side quests during the first chapter, with maybe a dozen or so added later in the game once you've reached certain main story beats. This might sound like a poor design decision, but you're not meant to do all the side quests in the first chapter. You're actually supposed to sprinkle them throughout your playthrough. I mean, just because the innkeeper sends you to the other side of the map to kill a troll or whatever, it doesn't mean that you actually have to complete that quest in the first chapter, or rather that your character will be strong enough to survive the trip in the first place. In terms of quest scenarios, I was honestly surprised at the variety on display. One moment you could be helping a hunter kill scavengers, and the next you're doing some shopping for a blind old man, or chopping logs and shooting the shit with a woodcutter, or delivering meat to a cook. Not them stringy cuts, mind you, the good ones. The juicy ones, or falling for a honey trap type scheme, or escorting a belligerent merchant to another settlement, or getting wasted with a mercenary and going on a booze-fueled hunting trip, or stealing a money ledger from a loan shark, or Selling drugs. Yeah, you heard me right. Selling drugs. Guess what other game has a quest where you sell drugs? I'll give you 3 guesses. It's made by an Essen-based German studio and the name starts with a G and ends with a C. One of my favorite quest lines in Drova involves an enterprising hunter called Gawain. On the surface, it seems like your typical RPG quest. Go to the woods, find his buddy's corpse, recover a precious stone from his body, and return it to Gawain with the promise he's going to sell it and give us our part at a later date. Later, when I returned to collect my cut, he made me a very interesting offer. What if I invest 500 gold in his sheep business and double my money later? The Gothic games, and by extension Drova, sort of condition you to never trust anybody. If it's too good to be true, like some rando promising amazing returns from a sheep business, then it probably fucking is. Something told me this guy was for real, so I forked out the money. When I approached him at the beginning of Act 3 to collect my coin, he asked me for another 1000 coin. His brilliant business venture? Hunting for treasure in the swamp with trained frogmen. The same frogmen who'd been blasting me with toxic acidic projectiles for the past 20 hours. I gave him the money. What could go wrong? And you know what happened? The dude actually delivered. I gained 3000 coins for my efforts and the distinction of having turned a profit from the stupidest business idea in existence. This was the moment when I was 100% convinced that Just 2D truly got what made the first 2 Gothic games so special. And I was sold on Drova's status as a true spiritual successor to that series. When I said that I love Gothic's realism, I didn't necessarily mean as dog-eat-dog world where everybody is out to stomp and exploit you, but also acknowledging that the world can be incredibly stupid and funny sometimes. And I think that's Drova's biggest achievement. Thanks for watching. As always, a huge thank you to my wonderful patrons whose generosity makes these videos possible. I'll see you next time.